I'm Elaine Howell, former California State Auditor, currently serving as a Senior Advisor for State, Local, Tribal, and Territorial Oversight for the PRAC. The vignette I'm going to share with you today is work that the California State Auditor's Office did in 2020 under its State High Risk Program. So what is the State High Risk Program in California? Well, the Auditor's Office in California has a program very similar. Actually, it was patterned after the program that GAO has had for years, where the Auditor's Office can identify an issue area at high risk in California for high risk for program mismanagement, ineffective operation, waste, fraud, abuse, etc. What's important about this is designating an issue area as a high-risk issue allows the auditor to self-initiate audit work. Typically, the auditor in California gets its work from the legislature either through statutory requirements, a bill being enacted requiring the auditor to do some work, or through the Joint Legislative Audit Committee, which is a committee of senators and assembly members in California that hold hearings throughout the year and direct work, approve audits, and direct that work to the auditor's office. The State High Risk Program requires the Auditor's Office to publish a biennial list of either issues or departments that are at high risk in California, again, for waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, etc. But that list can be updated periodically, can be updated during the year, and that's precisely what the Auditor's Office did in 2020. So when we were determining whether or not the receipt of pandemic relief funding in California would be deemed a high-risk issue, we had to consider certain risk factors in our assessment. First risk factor is the significant amount of money coming into California. We identified early in the year when we were looking at the CARES Act and some other legislation, there was upwards of $71 billion coming into California under pandemic relief. So that was a huge risk factor. Expansion or changes of program eligibility. A typical program, some eligibility requirements change. UI program is a perfect example where self-employed individuals in the past were not eligible for benefits, but under pandemic relief, they were. Program changes that required the administration in California to reach out to Californians to let them know these programs, you may be eligible for benefits. So we wanted to make sure we included that as a risk factor in determining whether or not the administration was doing a good job of educating folks in California. Certainly past audit findings, really important. This is a single audit. The Auditor's Office knows full well which state agencies do a good job of administering federal programs and which ones struggle. So that was a risk factor. And then the rapid nature or allocation and urgent need for the funding. The allocations came in very quickly. The money needed to get out very quickly to help people. So that was another risk factor that we included in our assessment. So we of course deemed the receipt of pandemic relief funding as a high-risk issue in California, issued our report in August of 2020. It was a 9-page report. The most important piece of that report, I think, was the table that identified 18 state agencies that were expected to receive at least $71 billion in pandemic relief funding. Those agencies would be responsible for administering or managing 35 different federal programs. So a lot of programs to be administered by these agencies. So once we deemed pandemic relief funding as a high-risk issue, it gave us the authority to self-initiate audits. So then we immediately went into planning mode and just looked at these different considerations in our planning efforts, the impact of the various federal programs on California. So looking at the UI program, looking at CRF, looking at epidemiology and lab capacity money coming into California, pandemic food relief assistance, etc. So looking at the various programs and what their impact would be. We had to consider the availability of our audit staff, our resources. How many of these audits, how many of these programs could we look at? How many of these state agencies could we get into? We clearly had to look at our audit processes, determine which processes needed to be adjusted so that we could expedite the work. We could not take 6 to 8 months, which typically is what the auditor's office takes to conduct some of the audits that they do. Some take longer, but usually the time frame is 6 to 8 months. But that's, again, way too long for these projects that we were going to work on. Excuse me, the types of products that we expected to produce. Is it going to be a 6-page letter? Is it going to be a 2-page infographic? Is it going to be a management letter? What type of products did we anticipate producing? We talked about the timing and sequencing of audit reports. This ties to the next bullet as far as legislative calendar. We had to get this audit work done while the legislature was in session during their budget deliberations, because to the extent we had recommendations related to funding, or the legislature determined that they needed to shift some funding or provide additional funding for certain state departments to administer these programs, we needed to get that information to them while they were deliberating, not after the fact. It's too late. Same thing with legislation. There's a legislative calendar for when bills have to be introduced, when they have to make it out of certain committees, when they need to get to the governor. If there's going to be urgency legislation, we needed to get the information to the legislature timely so that they could take the steps they needed to take to assist California in responding to the pandemic. So what are the impacts of the projects that we did? Well, we audited 11 agencies, their management of 8 different programs, $54 billion out of the $71 billion that was in the chart in that August report. During a 1-year window from November of 2020 to November of 2021, we issued 12 audits and covered a variety of different programs. The UI program was the biggest. It was $40 billion out of the $54 billion, but certainly looked at education stabilization, CRF, pandemic food assistance, etc. What legislative action happened? Shortly after we issued the assessment, the determination, the designation of pandemic relief funding as a high-risk issue, the legislature came to us in September with an emergency audit request of the unemployment insurance program and our employment development department's administration of that program from 2 different perspectives. One, in providing benefits to Californians, being able to provide assistance to Californians in applying for benefits. And then the other report was related to fraud prevention, detection, etc. Because we had deemed it high risk, we could throw more resources at it. We weren't limited to the constraints of an emergency audit request, which has a cost constraint to it. But that clearly was a response that the legislature had to our high risk designation. They wanted us to get into EDD right away and do some audit work. The legislature held multiple hearings, mostly throughout 2021. After we completed many of these audits, there would be a policy committee hearing or a budget committee hearing. Certainly oversight committees had hearings where some of my former staff presented the results of some of the audit work that we did, and the administration would be at those hearings as well. There were multiple bills introduced during the legislative year. Many of those bills had bipartisan support. The emergency audit request had 40 members sign on out of 120 members. The bills related to EDD had bipartisan authorship. Many of those bills passed unanimously out of committees, passed unanimously off the floor to get to the governor's desk. And these bills tied to fraud detection and prevention. What tools is EDD using? Are they assessing the impact of those tools, the effectiveness of those tools? Another bill tied to being able to cross-match UI unemployment applications to individuals who are incarcerated in correctional facilities in California. So these are bills that not only assisted EDD during the pandemic, so they could start doing that cross-matching, but it's going to assist the Employment Development Department in administration of UI programs in the future. So it's an immediate impact, but then long-lasting impact as well. So if you have any questions related to the product we issued in August of 2020, or my former office issued in August of 2020, or any of the audits, you can certainly reach out to me at the email address on the screen, or you can reach out to the California State Auditor's Office. Their website address is on there. They have a webmaster where you can submit questions, or you can call their main number and be connected with someone who either worked on some of these projects or can answer the questions that you might have. Again, appreciate your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of the forum, and thanks again.